Want to thank everybody first and foremost for joining us. We've tried to design this session to be both strategic and actionable, whether you're just beginning your sustainability journey or you're already deep into implementation. There should be insights here that can help you navigate what really has proven to be a rapidly evolving landscape that we're all operating within. So, I want to start by just giving a little bit of context of why are we here today. The built environment, construction, architecture, engineering, real estate, and beyond represents a really critical component of global sustainability and an early mover in the broader decarbonization movement, facing a lot of pressure, but also progress. So, over 60 countries now have building decarbonization policies in force. New York Local Law 97 fines began in 2025, with enforcement already active in Washington, D.C., and Colorado. And green buildings have been shown by GRESB and JLL reports from them in the last 2 years to have 7 to 12% rental premium and 10 to 15% higher asset values. And non-compliant buildings, from an energy efficiency perspective, face about a 15 to 30% depreciation in risk value projected by 2025. So we'll see if those figures have proven out over the last year. Um, that's just a little bit of context to, get you settled. We'll go through a lot more stats as we go through. But before we dive in, I want to introduce our expert panel, each bringing a unique perspective to today's conversation. So I'm going to play the part of guiding us through how firms can operationalize carbon accounting across portfolios and supply chains, turning what can feel really overwhelming into a manageable, more systematic process, and a little bit more on regulations policy perspective. But much more importantly, joining me is Dr. Rachel Engstrand, Head of Science at CNOT. Welcome, Rachel. Rachel brings deep scientific expertise on high integrity carbon credits and will help us understand offset strategies and their appropriate role when emissions cannot be eliminated. Um, and then also we're joined by Jonathan Flaherty, the Global Head of Sustainability at Tishman Speyer. Welcome, Jonathan. He'll bring to life real-world examples of how sustainability gets embedded into building design, operations, lifecycle management at one of the world's leading real estate firms. So thank you both for being here today. And I'm just going to walk us briefly through the agenda, and then we'll start to kind of hand things off for folks. Please do feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a number of different options: participants, chat, react, share, and Q&A. At least that's the group that's available to me. So go ahead and take a look, click on Q&A. You can drop questions there. If you can't figure that out, you're having issues, feel free to drop them in the chat. Or if you think of something later, you can email them to us, of course. Happy to receive those. So here's what we'll cover today. We'll start by examining the state of sustainability in our industry, move through key trends and regulations that you'll need to be tracking, give you some updates on recent regulatory changes, discuss both the drivers pushing us forward and the barriers that we're all facing, and then take a little look ahead, of course, trying to prioritize and leave a little bit of room for Q&A. We will definitely be sending the slides out, and so I know it's a pretty chronic problem to not leave enough time at the end for the Q&A, so I really want to try to avoid that. So I hope you'll forgive me. Definitely in my section, I go through a lot of detail on the regulations, especially. These are takeaways. I'm happy to send them out. I know everyone's been in the news a lot, so happy to answer questions on those, but might do a little more skimming than typical. And so with that, I would love to hand it off to Jonathan to talk through the state of sustainability in the built environment.
Great. Well, thank you. And thank you all for having me today. Jonathan Flaherty, I'm the Global Head of Sustainability at Tishman Speyer Properties. Tishman Speyer Properties is a global real estate developer, asset manager, fund manager, and operator. And we operate in 12 states in the US, 5 countries in the EU, Brazil, India, China, and a smattering of other countries as well. We both operate, build, and own both residential, commercial, and industrial assets. So thanks for having me. I'm not going to read these bullets. I think they're probably pretty well known, but the built environment is a big, big chunk of the carbon emissions globally. And there it is, excuse me, and arguably It's one of the most in many ways, real estate is not highly regulated, but in the case of energy and carbon and how that is looked at globally, real estate and the built environment is not only a huge contributor, but also, unlike a lot of other sectors like aviation or agriculture, the answers to how to decarbonize the built environment are fairly well known and are not necessarily requiring of inventing new fuels or new machines or any number of other things. There are certain pockets of sectors that have challenges in the built environment, but one of the reasons why the built environment is such a focus across the globe is because there really are answers on how to decarbonize, and there are pathways to do so for the vast majority of assets. And so, with that in mind, when you look at investor demand, regulatory pressure, and client expectations, they're not coming from nowhere. They're coming from the fact that people understand that the built environment does have a pathway forward, and there are ways to decarbonize both at the asset level and at the grid and larger energy landscape level. So, to state the obvious and read slide bullet number two, the pressure from regulatory agencies and governments, investors, and clients is high. I would just add on that point that it's interesting today. If you would ask somebody in this field 10 years ago what the order of those would be, I think a lot of folks would have thought it would have been regulations followed by tenants, followed by capital. It really has ended up, at least in our world, being capital driving that conversation, and then tenants and regulators less of a bigger play. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation. Um, but I think that the third bullet highlights the fact that this isn't hopeless. And not only is it not hopeless, but firms that take advantage of what is available out there can absolutely have a competitive advantage and reduce risk in the future and future-proof their business. And we are absolutely part of that trend here at TishInspire. And I know many, many other real estate players are as well. So let's jump to the next slide. So what is changing across the industry? Well, net zero commitments have become the market standard in many countries. I think it's probably not a shocking piece of information to share that maybe not in the United States, but certainly throughout the world. And the US has obviously dabbled, but I wouldn't call it a market standard in the US yet. But it is certainly the direction that things are going. And it is absolutely a market standard in lots of other countries around the world. And in terms of scope three, I think the challenge there is embodied carbon is a clear focus, and we are absolutely focused on embodied carbon. The challenge with scope three is it encompasses a lot of things, and that has made it a bit difficult for people to figure out how to begin to disclose that. And there's also a lot of double counting and other issues. And so scope three has been a big challenge in terms of how to write regulations around that and how companies can disclose that. But embodied carbon in particular has become a much clearer playing field in terms of how it works, what you should do to measure that, and how you should do it. And so I think, the slide reads well, embodied carbon in scope three is absolutely where the sort of direction of travel is. It's not to say that disclosing many of the other aspects of scope three aren't important, but embodied carbon is a huge piece of the puzzle. And for the built environment, it's not exactly listed here, but the actual carbon that goes into construction is far, far, far greater than what goes into the operational side. And so embodied carbon is absolutely becoming an increased area of scrutiny and of focus for large firms, especially developers and merchant developers. And then lastly, tenants, investors, and regulators are aligning. I certainly think that investors and regulators are aligning. Tenants are a little bit all over the place, depends on the industry, depends on the region, but you're absolutely seeing focus people, all those groups aligning, generally speaking, on the need to reduce carbon, the need to measure carbon, and the need to move towards a goal of net zero operational carbon, and hopefully eventually a thought on how we get to, I'm not going to say net zero embodied carbon because it's not quite clear how one would do that just yet, but certainly that's the direction of travel and where people are focused on. And then that, I think I turn it back over to Corrine. I think you're muted.
I'm on mute at least once a day. Thanks, Jonathan. I appreciate that. And yes, I'm happy to take us through the trends and regulations. And part of this is that I'm going to paint a slightly rosier picture than I think a lot of people would expect me to paint. And it's not that I'm cherry picking stats, it's that, I'm seeing reflected in the numbers what I am experiencing anecdotally, which is that corporate action is still really strong and very much a driver of climate action. And that's true in the built environment as well. So I think that this chart tells a really powerful story that 45% of the Fortune 500 now have net zero targets. And if we look at that pink line, net zero commitments have grown from nearly 7% in 2020 to 45% in 2024. And those have not gone away. We're seeing that reflected elsewhere too in reporting. What's equally important is that nearly half of Fortune 500 leaders now require suppliers to meet ESG criteria. Companies like Apple, Google, Microsoft are mandating emissions tracking and reductions plans for their supply chains. So if you're in real estate, architecture, construction, development, that means that your clients are increasingly asking for your carbon data. And it's not coming, it's just not a future state. This is happening, this is here, this has been here for quite some time. And I've been really sort of fortified to see that CEOs are really sticking with their climate strategies. So despite political headwinds, economic uncertainty, a lot of challenges, those commitments are remaining strong. KPMG has an October 2024 CEO outlook. Two and three CEOs remain committed to their climate strategies, though they're adapting messaging. That's been very much true anecdotally in 2025, working with lots of clients on various ways to be quieter but persistent in their pursuit of neutrality or decarbonization. Two and three say they're confident their companies will achieve near-term climate goals despite challenges, and two and three anticipate significant returns from sustainability efforts over the next 5 years. Of course, that's what we're seeing in the built environment, the stats I referenced earlier of premiums on both rental and assets. And then 56% of the G250 companies now have a dedicated sustainability leader, up from 45% in 2022. 95% of the world's top 250 companies are publishing carbon targets. So this is all, structural and not superficial and very hard to roll back. So that's a really positive indicator. And then I promise this will be the last slide where I'm kind of killing you with stats. But I think it's useful, and I'm hoping that these are useful as a sort of leave behind as well. But let's look at the data behind the headlines. In 2024, over almost 25,000 companies disclosed environmental data through CDP, up significantly and demonstrating sustained momentum into 2025 reporting cycles. They haven't released their final numbers yet for this year, so we'll provide an update as soon as we have that. Over 4,000 companies reported climate commitments in 2024, ninefold increase over 5 years. And as of 2025, early reports about July in the year, over 10,000 companies have set or committed to science-based climate targets. And that's a really important stat to keep track of. Where are companies publicly disclosing, but also committing to maintaining progress? Uh, 84% holding steady on climate targets, 37% of those are increasing ambition, and only about 16% are scaling back. And we don't have great detail about the ways in which they're scaling back, but most of what we're seeing is around messaging and not necessarily action. SBTi's trend tracker shows near-term target setting grew 97%. Companies with both near-term and net zero targets grew approximately 227% between 2023 and mid-2025. And I really like this one, sort of a democratization indicator. The median revenue of companies making climate commitments dropped from 3.6 billion to 1.3 billion in 2024. So all of that pressure on suppliers has been showing us that we're seeing commitments prove out across a wider set of companies that have a different representation of revenue. And so, Jonathan, I'll pass back to you to talk about how we're seeing that materialize in net zero buildings.
Sure. So in terms of net zero buildings, I think it's important to just remind that we're not talking about net zero energy here. We're talking about net zero carbon. And so, we want to build buildings that use as little energy as possible, but the near-term focus is absolutely on carbon. However, much of that can be achieved by energy efficiency as well. And so tenant demand for low carbon space is coming both from the fact that the cost of operating that space is increased and therefore less energy hopefully equals less cost in running it, as well as both employee demand within the firm and investors that are asking for that low carbon space. We also see investor scrutiny of real asset emissions. This is something that we very much are aware of at Just Inspire. We see it all over our investor base. I will say here that this certainly is a global phenomena, but there are notable countries that are much farther ahead in asking these questions, and there are some countries that and pension funds and larger operators that are a bit behind in asking these questions. And certainly we'll talk about again some of the challenges in the US in a couple slides. But absolutely the investor scrutiny on emissions remains as high as it's ever been and has not changed in the last 24 months. And then finally, rising energy costs and climate risk. I mean, I think this goes without saying, but the cost of energy, especially electricity, is continuing to go straight up in the United States. It has also gone straight up in Europe, and there is no evidence that that is going to change in the future, despite changes in the availability and pricing of liquid fuels like LNG and oil and others. That is not driving to the electrical sector at all. And the vast majority, and we're going to talk about as important as it is to electrify and as important as it is to move buildings off fossil fuels, the reality is fossil fuels are a much smaller part of the puzzle in the built environment for many of the sectors we're talking about. And so even though the price of those goods have gone down, the price of electricity has gone straight up, and we anticipate that continuing throughout everywhere we operate in the world, literally for the foreseeable future. So rising energy costs are a big risk, and they are a big drag on earnings at these buildings and in NOI. And so anything we can do to focus on energy costs is absolutely on the radar as an operator of buildings. And to that point, the practical steps forward to address those issues, the number one thing we look at every asset is energy efficiency. It's always the cheapest way to both reduce your overall costs and reduce your carbon. It's obviously not a direct link between electricity and carbon because it depends greatly on the grid mix and what's going on in that particular area. But nevertheless, energy efficiency is always the cheapest way to proceed, and that is the first place that we look. Um, We also have a plan to, and we see across the board folks thinking about electrifying systems where feasible. I think this ties into the fourth bullet, integrate sustainability into capital planning. It's a hard case to be made today to electrify building systems before their end of useful life. Meaning, if you have a chiller that has, it's a 25-year chiller and you got 10 years left on it, replacing it with an electrical heat pump is a great idea from a carbon perspective, but the reality is the operating costs will be higher, upfront capital will be higher, and unfortunately, you wouldn't even necessarily have better emissions. It totally depends on the grid and the location. So electrifying is absolutely the plan, but it really should be done as part of an integrated capital planning process with sustainability as a significant part of that. And so what that really means is ensuring that you never replace in kind, and you understand what the equipment in the buildings are and what the systems are, and you know how to electrify that or decarbonize that in the future. And you have a good idea of when you want to do it. But in real estate, many things can change in a short amount of time, including the tenants you have, the leases you have, the mortgage you have. And so, I think the fourth bullet's almost the most important after energy efficiency, which is making sure you have a capital plan for the asset, you know how to get to net zero, you know how to electrify. When exactly you're going to do those things is going to play out on the ground in any number of ways, but that you have a plan in your back pocket, you know how to do it. And so when something does need to be done, you're not replacing in kind. Lastly, I would say procuring renewable energy strategically is important, but it's a much more complicated game. It does not work in a lot of places. There are very different rules in different places. And there are markets in Europe where you click a box on your bill and magically you have green energy. Unfortunately, that's not the case in most of the United States. And so I'm not going to suggest you shouldn't do this absolutely, but bullet three is complex and cannot be easily done in many cases. And so, at least the way we think about it, energy efficiency is first, and then capital planning, followed by electrification, and then we will procure renewable energy strategically where we believe it is appropriate.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about this more. We did get a couple of questions in advance of this conversation, so we'll get into it in the Q&A. But prior to Green Places, I was running sustainability at SH Hotels and Resorts, and a lot of those operational challenges persist. You definitely can't retire things prior to their end of life. Nobody's going to support that internally. Your CFO would have a heart attack. So, in addition to those operational changes and challenges, obviously, this past year has been absolute chaos on the regulatory side. And so before I get into some of the more detailed updates, I wanted to provide a little refresher here about the California laws, the California Climate Accountability Act, representing SB 261 and SB 253. And so just as a little bit of a refresher, 261 requires public and private U.S. companies other than insurance companies that do business in California with the total revenue exceeding $500 million in the prior fiscal year to post a climate-related financial risk report to their website by January 1st, 2026, with biennial updates every 2 years after that. SB 253 requires public and private U.S. companies that do business in California with total revenue in the prior fiscal year exceeding $1 billion to annually report on scopes 1 and 2, um, including third-party limited assurance over those metrics, beginning in 2026, covering fiscal year 2025, although some adjustments there from the last CARB workshop. and on scope 3 emissions beginning in 2027, covering fiscal year 2026, regardless of materiality. Obviously, some changes late in the year to those pieces of regulation that we're going to go through now. Um, and so on November 18th, the Ninth Circuit issued an order temporarily pausing California's climate risk reporting law, SB 261. And that was the first of the reports which were due in January 1st, 2026 to post to your own website. It does not similarly halt the annual greenhouse gas emissions reporting law, SB 253. So the risk assessment and the uh, carbon reporting laws are distinct, and risk assessment law obviously has been stayed until a hearing. During CARB's public workshop, staff proposed an August 10th, 2026 reporting deadline for SB 253, which is delayed from the initial June 30th, 2026 date, and its rulemaking process was extended into Q1 2026. So we're still waiting to hear final details on SB 253. I could go into a lot of detail about the substantive changes to those two pieces of regulation. We've hosted a number of individual workshops and webinars just on this piece alone. There's a lot of content on our website, but ultimately, the thing that I want to flag here is that from every single legal expert that I've spoken to, all of the work that we've done so far in this space, expectations around preparing for these regulations are at the same level that they were previously. There's a lot of uncertainty, especially with SB 253, the way that the bill is structured, um, and the way that we're seeing this play out in the courts suggests that enforcement will stay as anticipated. And for SB 261, though a lot more is sort of uncertain in the immediate moment, most of our clients have been continuing to submit, to post, to prepare. And I'll just remind folks that the intent of these is not to be a massive burden on companies, though of course we recognize that there is a burden on companies to report. But ideally, these are self-serving, that understanding your carbon emissions, how you can decarbonize, how you can accrue those premiums that we talked about at the beginning, is by understanding the footprint that you're already responsible for and where to mitigate and reduce. And the same is true even tenfold for understanding climate risk. Buildings are fixed assets that pose long-term risks to asset holders. So if you're investing capital in that space, you want to understand what risks persist in those locations. And so conducting these assessments is beneficial for companies and has a long-standing in TCFD, et cetera. So when we get asked questions about how should we proceed given this uncertainty, we absolutely promote a readiness for SB 253 and potential SB 261 snapback. We have predictions about how these will play out. We can talk about it more in the Q&A if folks are really jazzed about that. But preparation is important. You're trying to mitigate risk here. Exactly. Um, Alignment with global reporting systems like CSRD, we know that these things are coming down the pike. So looking ahead is really important to figure out what does your data need to look like? What does best in class data need to look like? Having years to prepare for that is obviously a lot more preferable than working on it in the year disclosure requirements. It can lead to things like higher ESG ratings, CDP, EcoVadis, GRASP, and of course, stronger credibility with investors and supply chain partners. So lots of advantages here to continue to work through. And we want to talk now through drivers, barriers, scalability. And so I'll hand to Jonathan to start talking through the drivers.
Sure. So, I think we talked a little bit about it on the previous slides, but there's absolutely a growing client and investor interest in and expectations around ESG. I will say that I think that the term ESG has become challenging in the United States. We still see it widely used elsewhere in the world, but in the US, a little bit less so. What we do see is our clients and investors remaining having a laser-like focus on carbon and, the overall challenge of global warming. I think ESG is an extremely important framework, but has unfortunately in the United States become a little bit difficult to use in a way that leads to productive conversations consistently across the board. Having said that, again, we don't see any change in our investors or clients' expectations or desires to have a strong focus on energy, carbon, and global warming. It is absolutely a competitive differentiation in RFPs and leasing decisions. We see that for sure. Every RFP that we get on a leasing basis that has anything to do with this crosses our team's desk, and there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of these questions appearing in leasing RFPs in great detail, not just about our overall energy performance, but about a whole host of issues that occur in the building. And we have taken a strong interest, and all of our leases are green leases. And, that can mean actually a lot of different things, but the general movement towards tenants and landlords working together on these matters has increased dramatically over the last couple of years, and many leases and much standard lease language is oriented around all of those concepts as well. I think readiness and risk management. The regulatory frameworks are all over the place. One of the challenges in this space is that there are many different ones, and they are not aligned, and they are not consistently measured in different ways. Even standards that are considered to be particularly stringent, like CREM, are not the same in each country. The way CREM is organized is actually in a long conversation for another day, but you can meet CREM standards in one country and at the same time not in another country for reasons that are clear if you happen to know a lot about CREM. But the point is only that it is a complex set of frameworks all over the world. And so I think the most important thing here is for firms to be out there and open in data sharing and in showing how they perform. Because the different benchmarks are also tend to be very regional. And so some people have heard of this one, some people have heard of that one. When we look at big clients and operators around the world, who uses which frameworks is all over the place. And so more important is actually disclosing the data, and then you can use that to compare to any number of frameworks. And then cost visibility and operational efficiency we talked about before, but the cost of electricity has gone up in every market we operate in substantially over the last 5 years, and we anticipate dramatically more increases in this space in the future. And that isn't obviously our opinion, that's the consensus across the industry. So being prepared for those outcomes is both appropriate and timely, and it isn't going to get better, so you should start now. So those are clearly the primary drivers. Jumping into some of the barriers, I mean, look, I am going to not discuss anything related to the government per se, except to highlight the fact that that's not why we do this to begin with. Right now, there are reasons that if there are laws that say we have to do X, we're going to do X. But I think the most important thing here to understand is that our driving in this space is driven by the fact that our customers, investors, and tenants care, ask, and want to measure, know, and use that in their reporting and in their business practices. There are certainly challenges with the current administration in Washington as it relates to global warming and carbon, and that's not a newsflash. But I think that that is not the headline here. The headline and the reality also, as a reminder, is that real estate in the United States is pretty lightly regulated by the federal government. In fact, the federal government has virtually nothing to do with the commercial real estate sector beyond, say, taxes. And so regulation in real estate comes from the state and local level. And so that has not changed. And although the federal landscape has changed, it isn't why we do what we do, and it isn't driving what we do. Now, I'm not going to suggest that's the case everywhere, but I think certainly those are barriers, but I don't believe they are barriers that are insurmountable anywhere in the United States in any sector. And so you should absolutely, take that step forward. Energy efficiency is not partisan. There's no reason to be concerned. Reducing the amount of energy you use and saving money in an asset is a good idea, no matter who's in charge in Washington, D.C. So having said that, I think the challenge here in my mind is more around gaining consensus within an organization to do that, creating the necessary internal changes to be able to do that. And the sort of the challenges there. The good news is because the cost of electricity and many other goods has gone up so much, usually the payback is there. Usually the financial ability to say this is a good idea is already there. And so I actually think of all of the bullets here, the one that is most concerning is probably the challenges in the renewables, EV, and solar sector. I would say, though, that the great news is that the cost of installing solar is now by far the lowest it's ever been ever, no surprise. But it's also dramatically lower than every other source of energy, to the point that it's hard to say solar isn't the answer every single time, no matter what the regulatory landscape is. And so that's fantastic news. And the cheapest electron to put on the grid everywhere on Earth today is solar for sure, every day in every way. And so that is fantastic news. And even though there is challenges in that space, I think we're going to be able to overcome those just purely based on the economics alone. And then talking about this slide, this is really what I was just hinting on a moment ago, but really being able to gain that consensus internally and drive that conversation is absolutely, I think, the number one barrier. Fragmented, incomplete data is a, perennial challenge. And that is exactly why you should be calling Green Places and getting their help to figure out that piece of the puzzle, because that is a big piece of the puzzle and is a complex piece of the puzzle, and Excel is not the answer. I think limited internal ownership is that stuff I was talking about in terms of building consensus. Unclear scope three boundaries, I agree, is a problem, but I think it's more of a problem in that, that's inside baseball and inside baseball, right? Like nobody knows what scope three is to begin with, and now we're talking about the boundaries of scope three. I think that's a problem, but I would just appreciate if the, one out of every 100 Americans even knew what scope three meant. So I think that's potentially a slightly larger barrier than the boundaries, but nevertheless worth discussing. And then, carbon accounting, I think can be time intensive and technically complex. But that's the whole point of taking the step to de complexity that's not a word, but to make that easier and use software to be able to do that to help you get there.
Yeah, and just building on that conversation of scope three challenges, this has really plagued me for the majority of my career. I think that it's a really valid concern from companies that we don't understand boundaries here. We don't even understand what scope three is. So I just want to dig into this a little bit and again come back to it in the Q&A.
And it's not taking
Uh,
anything away from your slide. I just think, I love this, and we could all, the three of us, talk about the details of the scope three boundaries and the challenges of scope three, and they're all very important. But I'm afraid the larger issue is nobody knows what scope three is, which
Absolutely. Well, and they fit together, right? Like I think if it were easier to track and easier to communicate, then it would be managed better. But also people would understand it better. And it's not the first time that it would be said that sustainability has a branding and a messaging problem. We have a real marketing problem in this sector. And the same is it's that's even more important when you get into the fact that you're not working with a bunch of other baseball players. You're working with all different types of stakeholders that need to be speaking the same language. And so scope three, when we talk about that bucket, the everything else, the indirect emissions, there are so many challenges in addition to not even understanding what it is we're supposed to start with. But the incomplete coverage conversation comes up over and over and over again. Many companies do disclose scope three emissions, but many also omit the most material categories, and that's permitted under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and is reasonable. It's very hard to capture data across all of your scope three categories. About 45% of CDP submissions in 2024 fit into that category of reporting scope three, but not excluding their most material categories. There's also really low quality data often. We use estimations often in our calculations process. They're a great place to start. But you do eventually want to move toward primary data and toward more integrated systems, not collecting data via survey every single year. It's a massive burden. And so that weak methodology here of uh, gathering the data, but then also sometimes doing the calculations. When folks are working in Excel, working with free tools, doing them back in napkin approach, again, great place to start. But when you start to get into the space of reporting publicly, certainly getting audits or assurance, you definitely want to make sure that your methodologies are sound. You're working with organizations that have seen all of the edge cases before. And so that's a big part of it. Lack of transparency and assurance definitely erodes confidence in your reported progress. If you're able to go back and say, we're looking at the last 5 years, we actually see you've omitted your most material category, and you're not being transparent about your real emissions, then companies face a risk there from reputation. But we do see a lot of emerging fixes to these problems, and the progress of AI is really remarkable. But the process of software technologies is also pretty remarkable. So AI-enabled data tools, supplier roadmaps, procurement integration, and obviously training. What is scope three? What do you need to collect? How do we add this KPI to your existing tracking system? Um, and if we move to the next slide, that's a lot of what we do at Green Places is trying to simplify this process, prevent everyone from banging their heads against a brick wall over and over and over again. It doesn't need to be such a headache annually. I think once you figure out the process for your company with your operational boundaries, with your financial boundaries, then you start to understand who the stakeholders are, who you need to reach out to. And so we try to make this process as automated, as simple as possible, while not deprioritizing expertise, detail, technical proficiency. You really do need both in this space because this data should underpin decisions that you're making strategically, requirements you place on suppliers, information you disclose to investors. The goal here is really just to make carbon accounting systematic, scalable, strategic, not just a compliance exercise. This information should go back into your key performance indicators, your data, and ideally be integrated with procurement systems so you can make decisions about what to buy, from whom, what standards to include, what goes into contracts so that you're not held accountable to standards that you have no ability to change, which is really a barrier with Scope 3. And so I want Jonathan and then Rachel to take us through like how is this getting operationalized? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, I mean, we talked about it a little bit before, but I mean, energy efficiency is absolutely where you want to start, and what we are absolutely doing every time we buy an asset or build it. Well, not so much building an asset because that's built into the development and design of the asset, but energy efficiency is clearly where you want to start and where you want to look. High performance materials and optimized building systems are also super important, in particular, optimized building systems. That can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different buildings, but the important part is to make sure that you both have a BMS or a BAS and that it is actually programmed and operational at your asset by somebody who's actually operating it and understands how it works. Portfolio-wide net zero operational commitments are absolutely critical, and we have, as a company, made those commitments across the board, across our entire global portfolio. And it's a great way to get people focused, and it's a great way to get that ball rolling. Um, as it was stated earlier in the presentation, a very, very high percentage of companies in Europe and a lesser, but still high percentage in the United States have portfolio-wide net zero operational carbon commitments. And I will add also that many of our investors require that you have one before they will even do business with you. So this is really table stakes. Sustainability embedded across the development, operations, and lifecycle management. I mean, that's really thinking about that earlier bullet about sustainability and capital planning and how you think about the asset over the time that you're going to own it in terms of both capital, operational, and how all those different building systems and pieces of the puzzle will fit together. And then look, we're a big fan of certifications. I'm not going to tell you that LEED is going to solve global warming, but I think that having third-party verification of what you do in assets and how you do them and being measured to a standard that isn't yours alone, that you are being measured by others, is a great way to show that you're committed and to show that you really mean what you have to say. And that's certainly how we think about certifications. And then lastly, the role of cross-functional teams. I mean, this is kind of what I touched on much earlier about barriers. I think again, much of the challenge for many folks in this space is lining everybody up internally and getting the buy-in to do it. And so a lot of that is realizing that there are a lot of different departments that sustainability and ESG touch across the business. And accounting, finance, facilities, real estate, HR, people operations, but also leasing. We could go long list. And so how you work with each of those pieces of the puzzle is critically important. And arguably the person who's driving all of this in your firm is going to be one of the most political people in the firm. And this is not somebody meaning political like politics, Democrats and Republicans. This means somebody who knows everybody, who understands how teams work, who understands how the company works, understands where the drivers are to change, and is able to drive those through those cross-functional teams. Sustainability is all about working with others, not doing it in a silo. And so how do you work across the organization effectively to touch all these different people and get them to want to do the plan and what you are doing?
Great, thanks. So I'm going to talk a bit about how carbon credits can serve as a valuable tool in your carbon neutrality toolkit. So, when it comes to construction materials, some operational and embodied carbon can't be reduced entirely or with today's technology. So that's where high integrity carbon credits come in. Currently, they're the only viable solution for mitigating these unavoidable emissions, and they provide a credible pathway to carbon neutrality as reduction technologies continue to scale and mature over time. And then as a bonus, they're also a great way to support the development and scaling of important climate mitigation technologies and help your sustainability efforts go beyond just your own value chain. Next slide, please. So, carbon credits aren't just a theoretical solution. They're backed by leading experts across the industry. Major firms like Jacobs, Arup, Skanska, and groups like AIA have all recognized their value and use carbon credits. The Environmental Defense Fund highlights how aligning voluntary carbon markets around integrity and transparency can create real value for investors, companies, and of course the planet. The World Economic Forum encourages businesses to consider adding carbon credits to their climate action plans. And according to Bloomberg, 8 of the world's 10 most valuable brands are already using carbon credits to and understand that protecting their reputation means taking meaningful climate action. Next slide, please. Of course, carbon credits are not without their challenges. I'm sure many of you are aware of some of these challenges as it's been widely covered in the media. To use carbon credits well, it's very important to be aware of what these challenges are and how to overcome them. Some of these are operational challenges, which, they will create extra work for your team if you don't have someone that is already experienced at navigating these challenges. This is, the voluntary carbon market is highly balkanized. There's many registries and standards. There's hundreds of project methodologies, so it can be a complicated space to navigate. Procuring credits can be complicated. And then, of course, pricing varies a lot over time as well as across projects. But the biggest challenge, and the one that probably people are most aware of, is quality is very inconsistent across projects. So there are many carbon credit projects out there with major quality challenges. Luckily, there are ways to overcome this, which I'm going to go through briefly in the next through few slides. Next slide, please. So, there are many different types of carbon projects out there that have very different impacts, both for the environment and the benefits they provide, and also for the challenges that they face. Oh, it looks like a header disappeared. But anyway, these types of projects broadly can be classified under technology-based reductions, conservation, technology-based removals, and nature-based removals. And these classifications have come from the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Carbon Offsetting, which is widely regarded as the standard setter for best practices when it comes to using carbon credits to make reputable carbon claims. So, one of the best ways to mitigate your risk, and one that is recommended by Oxford, is to take a portfolio approach and invest not just in one project, but many different projects across all of these project types. The nice benefit about this is that you're not just diversifying your risk here, you're also diversifying the benefits of your investment. So, different technologies, for example, direct air capture, can be very expensive, while others, like landfill gas capture, can be very economically efficient. So, taking a portfolio approach helps you balance out your cost basis, and it's also a great way to spread your impact across many different technologies and geographies. Next slide, please. You know, the most critical piece for assuring quality in your investment is unfortunately also the hardest piece, and that's, performing due diligence on carbon credit projects. So there are many different aspects of carbon credit quality that you want to look at. These are the four most crucial. So that's additionality. You want to ensure that the emission reduction or removal that the project is claiming would not have occurred absent credit revenue. So if they're protecting a forest, you want to make sure that forest had a real threat and it wasn't going to be conserved with or without carbon credit revenue. You want to look at their overcrediting risk. Projects must minimize the risk of overestimating their climate impact. You want to make sure the accounting methodologies they're using are conservative. You also want to look at durability, which is how long the project will keep carbon out of the atmosphere. This is also frequently called permanence. And you want to look at double counting, which is you want to make sure that each ton of climate impact, each ton of carbon, can only be attributed to 1 ton of sorry, the phrasing here is throwing me off a little bit. You want to make sure that each credit can only be used once and not claimed by multiple parties. And, you can do this by building up due diligence capacity on your own team or partnering with a provider that can perform this diligence for you. Another approach you can take, next slide, please, is you can work with independent rating agencies. So these are highly credible agencies that have assembled teams of carbon credit experts to review the quality of carbon projects. And some of the agents, the biggest four right now are, Calyx Global, Renoster, B0, and Silvera. So these agencies will do in-depth due diligence for you, and they helpfully provide a nice score for each project. So, I often recommend that people set a floor of what quality they find acceptable when working with these agencies. So, a minimum score that you're going to work with. You can, talk to some experts for guidance on what your floors should be. I know USGBC and ILFI and other groups are considering giving recommendations on floors. Um, but you can also speak with the agencies themselves on what they recommend. And all of these agencies currently make at least a snapshot of their scores available freely. So if you don't have the resources to subscribe, you can at least get a highlight of what is there. The downside to not doing your own due diligence, however, is that you don't necessarily know what biases these methodologies may have. Different rating agencies may give different scores to a project, and it can be very difficult to navigate this without that expertise. So I do always recommend that you have at least some internal expertise or work with a provider that can help you navigate that space as well. All right, I'll pass it back to Corinne. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Yes, and obviously we will send out this presentation and you will have access to all three of us if you have follow-up questions. So if you are looking to buy offsets or set a strategy and you want to get in touch with myself or Rachel, please do so. And I just want to give a little bit of a look ahead before we head into the Q&A. And so, starting off, a little bit self-serving here because, of course, we do work in carbon accounting, but this is the first company that I've worked for where this is a predominant focus, and that's, I think, more telling of the times than anything else. And the reason for that is that carbon has become the singular unit by which we can benchmark and compare performance across many different industries. We're not limited just to energy efficiency. That doesn't apply necessarily to all other sectors. Even within the built environment, that wouldn't be the best metric. So I like to point this out because carbon accounting really has become foundational to credible sustainability strategy. If you're not disclosing your emissions, then you're talking about fluff. And that's really public perception, and that's where we've landed, and that's why regulations hinge on your disclosing your carbon emissions as foundational. I truly hope I live to see the day where we've shifted more to a biodiversity metric and have expanded out because we've addressed carbon emissions to such an extreme extent. But for now, it's really important that you kind of nail that metric and nail your data around it. Another is that cross-functional collaboration improves speed and accuracy. So often we get questions about how do I engage my suppliers? What's the best strategy there? And the first thing I say is that you must start. We definitely try to guide companies toward prioritizing outreach and leaning on things like surveys and going through your existing procurement pathways to engage your suppliers through traditional means. Meeting them where they already are, is really important. But you need that kind of cross-functional collaboration. You need to befriend and connect with the different entities within your own organization and then branch out into your supply chain. Net zero buildings require operational, technical, and strategic alignment. This should come as no surprise. Net zero buildings is a really big goal. And as both Jonathan and Rachel flagged, we don't currently have every technology launched on the market right now that would lead us easily to a net zero building. We can get closer and closer, and we're getting closer every year. But of course, you need things like strategic alignment in order to make that happen. You need to be setting that expectation with designers, with procurement teams, with construction teams, of course. It needs to go into contracts. So look at the earliest stage of engagement on developing a project. if you really want to see that out. It's not something that can be implemented as a retrofit as easily or as cost effectively. Um, High quality offsets are a tool, not a shortcut. And so one of the things I do like about the carbon offset market is that it's really robust and it's longstanding at this point. There's always an article every year, generally around Earth Day. You can wonder why, that tries to sort of decry offsets writ large. And those, if you look at them in detail, are really speaking to specific offsets or a company leveraging lower quality or lower integrity offsets. Largely, there's been a massive overhaul in structure here, and we'll continue to see low quality projects fall off of the market. But if you know what you're looking for, and certainly if you're looking at secondary rating agencies like B0, Silvera, et cetera, and working with partners that know what they're doing, that's what we'd recommend. This shouldn't be a strategy that you have to think a ton about annually. You should be able to sort of set and forget, this is what we're buying, this is an expected price, and let the market sort of stabilize around that. Then you can move into things like REX, SAF, sustainable aviation fuel for all of your business travel needs, et cetera. There are a lot of market instruments that are really important to this space. And then, of course, clear frameworks and disciplined execution drive long-term success. Decide where you're going to report, prioritize a few, and then stick to that execution. Trying to pivot every year is exhausting, time-consuming, and frankly, kind of a waste of your efforts. I really want folks to nail reporting. You can call us if you need support, and then focus on the work that actually needs to be done because that should be a smaller segment of what you're doing overall. So when we try to give a prioritized list of actions, one, prepare, make sure that you are ready for SB 253 and 261. Those are the North American regulations that matter the most right now. Do look internationally to guidance. The ISSB International Sustainability Standards Board that subsumed TCFD and is being leveraged by many countries internationally as the reporting standard by which you should disclose your wider ESG information, and CSRD, obviously, as the most robust regulation internationally as well that will eventually pertain to certain North American companies. Work to ensure data consistency across frameworks. So first you understand what you need to collect, who you're sending it to, and then you can work on the frameworks of your data and working to improve those. We provide guidance year on year for clients who are moving from estimations to primary data all the time. Work to embed climate risk into your enterprise risk management systems. Do you do tabletop exercises? Do you have a risk management function? Are they already speaking about climate change and climate-related risk? Especially in the built environment, that's a must. And then you can work to engage cross-functional teams, set your parameters, understand your data, start to disseminate that, and give folks something to hold on to as they start to understand where they play a role in understanding your emissions and working toward decarbonization. And so with that, I want to move us to the Q&A. Thank you all for listening to this presentation and for going through this in detail. If you have additional questions you want to post in the Q&A, go ahead and drop them here or in the chat. We did get a couple to kick us off, and so I'll field the first, but I think there's a couple in here that are maybe better suited for you, Jonathan, or you, Rachel, so I'll pass off to you. But the first question we have is, are formats like Notebook LM, where AI is only accessing a limited number of documents, less carbon intensive than other formats? And it's funny, I get AI questions from every single sector, all industries, so it does belong in this conversation. I'm glad somebody asked. Um, and again, happy to disseminate more information. The short answer here is yes. Retrieval augmented generation, RAG systems like Notebook LM are generally less carbon intensive than full generative AI models. And that's due to a couple of reasons. There's lots of articles about this and many studies, but mostly it comes down to training versus inference carbon costs. And so if you train a large model like ChatGPT, training the original GPT or GPT-3 that got released, generated over 500 tons of CO2, whereas inference, which is running queries, is much less carbon intensive. It's about 0.001 to zero point zero 0.01 kilograms of CO2 per query. So Notebook LM uses that retrieval augmented generation, meaning it leverages that pre-trained model, but limits generation to a constrained document set. So that reduces computational load. This also will depend heavily on, so like where I come into the caveats on this response here is that your carbon intensity will always relate to the infrastructure. So if there's not renewable energy on the grid where you're operating or where your data is stored, the data center's there, then you won't have a lower carbon intensity at all, despite whatever systems that you're implementing. So if Notebook LM runs on carbon efficient infrastructure, the per query footprint is then further minimized. Um, but yeah, ultimately, these systems don't require you continuously retraining massive models. They retrieve relevant passages from limited sets of documentation. So if you are starting to move into a foray where you are ideally not using Chat or Claude or whatever it might be, your AI of choice as a substitute for Google, but using it to build tools and systems and things like that, when you are looking at a more limited document set, looking at more efficient models is definitely um, a positive move. Anything that either of you want to add to that? Fantastic. Okay.
Not on that one, but I'm happy to jump in on others.
Okay, great. Um, so we talked about this a little bit, but I certainly have my own perspective, and I think folks have their own flavor of this. What is the biggest obstacle, hurdle, or roadblock other than legal or political to sustainability in the built environment? And maybe Jonathan, I'll start with you.
I mean, look, I think the answer most people think is the one that pops to mind is going to be capital, right? And how do I get the money to do the thing? I'm not sure that's actually the answer. I think capital will come once you make the case for the capital, right? And so I think internal consensus and understanding how to drive that success through the organization is the most critical piece of the puzzle and the biggest barrier, as I mentioned a little earlier. And I think that's once you've done that, then capital will come. I mean, I often hear at other, and other presentations and conversations, people are like, how do we get around the capital issue? How do we not talk about capital and make it? And that's, I think, the wrong way to approach it. I think you got to hit that issue head on. Pretending that there won't be costs is not going to help your case. Making the case that those costs are worth spending, and here's why, because of all of the things we just discussed, whether they be risks or whether they be fines and regulation or market demands, are all the ways to justify that spending, as opposed to saying, that finding the capital is the challenge. And so I guess in my book, it's all about that internal consensus and that organizational understanding to be able to drive that outcome and to be able to get everybody on board with that outcome. And with that in hand, capital and funding and support will follow.
Excellent. I think that's an extremely good point. We definitely have a lot of conversations about how to mobilize capital, but we don't have those conversations when the product is valued. So I think that's extremely fair.
And it doesn't always have to be a straight payback, right? It's not about that necessarily. I mean, we've talked about this about a billion times internally that there is no, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but there's no, at least in the way I think about it, there's no, green premium per se in office markets. There's a brown discount, right? And so, understanding that we want to be at the top of the market and set that standard, we want to show that that is all worth it and we can check every box. Is my little piece of the puzzle, whatever that is to get that building to be there, the thing that pushed that tenant over the line? It's probably all the things, right? But that's about, therefore, it's not solely about the payback. It's about positioning the asset, positioning the company, whatever that might be. And so I would just suggest that I'm not trying to minimize the challenge of getting capital, nor the challenge of a payback per se. I just think that people think about those things potentially fairly narrowly when they're trying to make the case.
Yeah, that's extremely true. Potentially our last question, since I know we're at time. Um, how should accounting for embodied and operational carbon emissions be equally distributed through the value chain? And I'm happy to take this one unless others want to chime in.
It's all yours.
Okay, great. We do get this question a lot. I think there's a conversation around equity, fairness, but also just who has access to the data. And there is guidance in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol about who owns this, and carbon accounting responsibilities should be based on control, influence, and data access. Omissions are possible when you do your reporting exercises if you don't have access to the data. So that piece might seem much more minimal than the others, but you can definitely fail or omit really significant material parts of your carbon emissions if you don't have access to the data. And so the idea here is that architects and engineers, developers and owners, contractors all play a different role in level of control, what influence they have, and data access. I could certainly write a much longer blog or do a webinar talking about the detailed accounting of where do we typically have specific emissions land? Is it in Scope 3 Cat 1, purchase goods and services? Um, and for embodied emissions, for architects and engineers versus developers and owners and contractors, that will land slightly differently. But the idea here is that it shouldn't really matter if you are collaborating across your value chain because you should be able to avoid double counting by understanding where real emissions accounting is happening. So before you even get to sort of an equitable distribution conversation, should be having a conversation of are those stakeholders all involved? And if they're not, that's your first step. So happy to send more out or sort of send me a direct message for sure if you guys would like more content specifically on the detailed carbon accounting. But I may prompt our team to do a blog on this topic specifically. With that, I know that we're at time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Rachel. We'll make sure we send a follow-up so that everyone has access to the presentation. And get in touch if you've got questions here, LinkedIn. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.